Hello there, it's Mark and welcome to book-ramble. And this one is about Plato's Crito. So Crito is the follow-up to the Apology, in which Socrates, on trial, is found guilty. He needles the audience, and he could have got away with perhaps a fine or being banished, but no, he deliberately provoked so that he was given the death penalty. And Crito, he is a gentleman, an old friend of Socrates, and we start with the prison of Socrates. It's not his prison, but he's in prison, with no doors, just a guard. He could have walked out. Crito appears at break of dawn in the prison of Socrates, whom he finds asleep. And Crito says, "It's the easy, tranquil manner in which you bear this calamity." No one could believe why Socrates didn't get on a boat and just go to another place and live in exile for 10 years. He gives the reason in Crito as to why, and it's become famous. You have to stand up for what you believe in, and he believed in the effectiveness of the laws of Athens. But also I wonder if he'd have gone into exile, especially after what he said at the trial, perhaps his star would have been diminished, and perhaps we wouldn't be talking about him now. And this is what Socrates says: "When a man has reached my age, he ought not to be repining at the approach of death." We have to remind ourselves that Socrates is an old man. He's in his 70s. And whereas you cannot compare really one age with another, I've been reading this excellent piece about the year 1000, in which it states that certainly in Britain in the year 1000, you were lucky to get beyond 40. That was the average lifespan. So to be 70, you did well. And of course, different place, different time, different climate. But even now, somebody in their 70s has had a very good innings. Socrates is languishing in prison for a while. He has to wait for the arrival of a ship from Delos. It was to do with a festival. When that ship arrives in Athens, that's when he has to take the hemlock. So he's against the clock. And Crito says, "Tomorrow, Socrates, will be the last day of your life," because that's when the ship is expected in. What makes Crito famous is the way in which Socrates has an image of a fair lady talking to him, who is justice. So he anthropomorphizes the laws of Athens to have a conversation with them. And we could do that the same in our place and time. That argues that you must stand up. You have been born into the city. You have fought all your life in the armies of the city. And in the modern context, that could be the military, or you have done public service or whatever. You have benefited from the democracy that Athens has given. Suddenly, when you're found guilty by the state, you can't go boo-hoo-hoo, but no, you must go through with the punishment, however severe it is. And that's the whole thrust of the argument. But interestingly, I've been talking with a mate of mine, Steve. On our other channel, we've been doing a deep dive of C.S. Lewis and his book, Mere Christianity. And in Book 2, Chapter 3, there's this fantastic run of writing, which I'm going to read out. So C.S. Lewis talks about human history. "The hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history. Money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery, the long, terrible story of man and woman, trying to find something other than God which will make him happy." Now, C.S. Lewis was by then a committed Christian. He'd converted just after the war or before, and he was obviously going to talk about that. In this instance, one of the reasons Socrates is in jail, because he was criticized as being atheos, against the gods of Athens, an atheist, impious. The anthropomorphizing of the laws makes the laws almost godlike. But this is the key. C.S. Lewis says, "Some fatal flaw always brings the selfish and cruel people to the top, and it all slides back into misery and ruin." Now, they're not the words and sentiments that would have been Socrates's, but you can almost say they're very similar. For some reason, the flaw in humanity is always people try to elevate themselves above the standard of the city or in the gods of the city, in a Christian context, higher than God, in the non-religious sense, better and bigger than the universe. There's always the big I am that comes to the surface, ignores the laws, completely becomes an autocrat, and then eventually will succumb and fall off the historical pedestal. It happened to Hitler, it happened to Stalin, it happened to Pol Pot, it happens to all tyrants. They never seem to learn. He says, there appeared to me the likeness of a woman, fair and comely, clothed in white raiment, who prophesies in the language of Homer that Socrates will die on the third day. Argues, like I said, that you've got to stand up to the law. In other words, don't be what C.S. Lewis wrote. Don't ignore the laws. You can't ride roughshod over the democratic laws if they are there. And that's what he does. He said, yeah, I could run. I could get on a ship and get out of here. I could live the rest of my life, whatever's left, in happiness, surrounded by friends, but possibly in obscurity. And Crito hears this over the run of the, well, it's not a play, but the text. And he tries to counter the arguments all the way through. He says, Socrates, the opinion of the many must be regarded. The many obviously want him to escape. And Socrates says, I wish it were so, Crito. The many could do the greatest evil, for then they would not be able to do the greatest good. What a fine thing this would be. But in reality, they can do neither, for they cannot make a man either wise or foolish, and whatever they do is the result of chance. So in other words, just because the majority, just because something is popular isn't always right. What is right isn't always popular. Just because the majority say something should be done is, as I read the text, a foolish thing to follow because they could do the greatest evil. They may be foolish. I don't know if it's fair or right to even bring up this. It just comes to my mind right now. I remember watching a video of about 2 to 3 years ago when it was very common, especially on the internet, to have videos and discussions recorded, panels about the threat of AI, taking away jobs. Do you remember those days? And one of the panel members of this particular one, I think it was in New York, said, one day AI is going to be as smart as the average person. And there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and, oh, that's going to be terrible. And one guy went very quiet. And he said, hang on, could you just say that again? Are you saying that in 2 to 3 years from then, which has not happened, that AI will be as clever as the average person? I said, yeah. And he said, well, we've got nothing to worry about then, have we? Most people are stupid. That's what Socrates is saying here. I only wish it was so, Crito, and that the many could do the greatest evil, for then they wouldn't also be able to do the greatest good. But in reality, they can do neither, because they cannot make a man either wise or foolish, and whatever they do is the result of chance. So some of the interesting arguments could be written today, for and against. Like Crito says, men will love you in other places to which you may go, not in Athens only. Go abroad. In acting thus, you are playing into the hands of your enemies, who are hurrying on your destruction. And further, I should say that you are deserting your own children, for you might bring them up and educate them. You appear to be choosing the easier part, not the better and the manlier, which would have been more becoming in one who professes to care for virtues in all his actions, and so on. But Socrates argues that he's not guided by that. He's not guided by the multitude, public opinion. Only one thing guides him. And by extension, because this is Plato writing for an audience, for ourselves, the one thing that should guide anybody is reason. Ought he to follow the opinion of the many or of the few, of the wise or of the unwise? And of course it's going to be the wise. Socrates says, I cannot repudiate my own words, the principles which I have hitherto honoured and revered. So he spent all his life talking about what is the correct thing to do, truth. He's not going to turn away from that now. Not even if the power of the multitude could inflict many more imprisonments, confiscations, deaths, frightening us like children and with hobgobbling terrors. Has anything changed? He says, in questions of just and unjust, fair and foul, good and evil, which are the subjects of our present consultation, ought we to follow the opinion of the many and to fear them, or the opinion of the one man who has understanding? Ought we not to fear and reverence him more than all the rest of the world? And if we desert him, shall we not destroy and injure that principle in us which may be assumed to be improved by justice and deteriorated by injustice? There is such a principle? Well, Crito has to agree to that. It's obviously common sense that you would follow the wise person. Of course, the modern debate now, which isn't necessarily here, define wise, and who's that? Will life be worth having, said Socrates, if that higher part of man be destroyed, which is improved by justice and depraved by injustice? And what he goes on to talk about is arete. What is the proper purpose of man? What is the point of being born? Is it to be venal, corrupt, only interested in wealth and status? I've said before, and I know this is an aside here, when you see young children and, say, dogs, when they come up to a person or when they look at a person, they don't see their status. They don't see their wealth or the clothes they're wearing. They see their energy. In fact, I was walking down the street this morning to get myself a coffee, and there was this dog tied up. Somebody had gone into, I think, an estate agent, real estate. And this person was walking towards the dog. Now, I can only say that he had a bit of trouble walking straight. And it's not because of illness. He'd been taking things, I think. He tried to go and say hello to the dog. The dog wouldn't have anything to do with it. Barked him away. And as I carried on walking, there was an older gentleman walking by who was infirm, and the dog went up and licked him. I think the dog recognised the energy of each individual person. The old guy was a real nice gentleman. The first one, something about him that the dog didn't like, because the older gentleman was more in line with arete. What is the point of our life? Well, it's to be just, kind, considerate, hopeful, helping of others, not the opposites. And that is said very clearly here. You notice the word I've put there, arete. So, what's the purpose of a pen? It's to write well. That's its arete, its purpose. What's the purpose of us? It's to be just and kind and all those good elements. And if we all do that in society, then society becomes just. The elements that try to overturn that, they're not arete. And that's not what we're meant to do. And if they're the ones saying, escape, don't worry about your principles, bribe the guard. No, that's not what you do. Because that's then no longer being arete. It's not life, but a good life that is to be chiefly valued. And that's the key. So if you admit then that the one purpose of ourselves is to be the best, most just, most loving person, and you are in the situation of Socrates, should you run or should you stay? Question: whether we shall do rightly either in escaping or in suffering others to aid in our escape and paying them in money and thanks, or whether in reality we shall not do rightly, and if the latter, then death or any other calamity which may ensue on my remaining here must not be allowed to enter into the calculation. He doesn't see his death as a calamity. He's standing up for justice. We ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him. It's almost Christ-like. And then the famous scene of the laws coming to argue with him. And he imagines this fantastic scene. Can a state exist in which law is set aside? And I am very conscious that this seems to be in the news right now. The laws and the government come and interrogate me. Tell us, Socrates, they say. What are you about? Are you not going by an act of yours to overturn us? The laws and the whole state as far as in you lies? Do you imagine that a state can subsist and not be overthrown, in which the decisions of law have no power, but are set aside and trampled upon by individuals? Answer, Socrates. Instead of opening your eyes, you are in the habit of asking and answering questions. Tell us, what complaint have you to make against us which justifies you in attempting to destroy us and the state? In the first place, Did we not bring you into existence? Your father married your mother by our aid and begat you. Say whether you have any objection to urge against those of us who regulate marriage. And Socrates, of course, would say no. Or against those of us who have, after your birth, regulated the nurture and education of children, in which you also were trained. Were not the laws, which have the charge of education, right in commanding your father to train you in music and gymnastic? Of course, that's very Greek. But now there are laws today. Some countries are trying to get rid of those laws, but nearly every country regulates education. Would you have a problem with that? The laws argue that he has made an implied agreement with them which he is not at liberty to break at his pleasure. The liberty which we allow you, that if he does not like us when he has become of age and has seen the ways of the city and made our acquaintance, he may go where he pleases and take his goods with him. If you don't like the laws of your place, go elsewhere. Don't try and break them. None of us laws will forbid him or interfere with him going. Anyone who does not like us and the city or the state, and who wants to emigrate to a colony or to any other city, may go where he likes, retaining his property. But he who has experience of the manner in which we order justice and administer the state, and still remains, has entered into an implied contract, that he will do as we command him, and he who disobeys us is thrice wrong. And of course, what Socrates then argues, goes on to argue that to run away would be to disgrace the laws, the state, his friends and himself. Let him think of justice first, and of life and children afterwards. Socrates has this mystic voice, this sense, this hearing he has of a knowingness that tells him, no, you must stay and you must follow the consequences. Crito, Plato. Amazing. So if you do what wrong, don't try and run away. In fact, Steve, the guy I do another channel with, we do a couple of channels actually, ex-copper, the one thing that he's learned with the law is that if you commit a crime or you do something wrong, don't try and hide it. The best thing to do is to fess up, face your punishment, and then get on with life afterwards. Because there will be life afterwards, unless you have committed a serious crime which you may spend the rest of your life in jail. But that is the consequence of your actions. We like justice, but do we like justice when it's done against ourselves? What unfolds in the Crito is quite difficult, because one, it's done in the distant past. What does that reflect on us now? Well, it reflects everything. Because if you take away the setting, and you've made the setting in the modern world, it would still be equally as valid. We as individuals, what's our role in life? Well, it's arete, to be the best possible upstanding person with all the virtues that are often taught, not so much now, but in the past. That you must be truthful, that you must be kind, open, responsible, receptive, accessible, all those things if you're in high status and public stations. But if you commit a wrong, don't try and hide it. Come out to the open and be prepared to step down or face a consequence. And it is a sad indictment of today that we read so often that's not the case. So this is a subject that has been talked about for thousands of years and we still don't get it right. We never will, of course, because that's human nature. But I'll go back to what C.S. Lewis talked about. Some fatal flaw always brings the selfish and cruel people to the top, and it all slides back into misery and ruin. So the only way to stop that is to make sure there's more people standing up for what is just and correct. And that's what I read the Crito to be. It's not very long. It's definitely worth reading. This is an anthology of his works, because you've got quite a few in here, as you can see. But it's one of the most powerful, most memorable, because of the way he anthropomorphizes the law that come to speak to him. Very powerful scene. And in fact, this is slightly abridged. The other version, which I've got, and I can't find it, don't know where it's gone, it reads better because there's more depth to it. There's more words. But you get this feeling in here. It's an exceptionally well-argued point that Plato makes here. bear in mind, what he's trying to do is to justify why Socrates didn't run. Everyone was expecting him to, perhaps even the people who found him guilty, because he could easily have walked out. There was no bars, there was no door. There was one guard who was half asleep, and they had enough money to pay him off, turn a blind eye. No one would have stopped him, I don't think. Even if he'd walked through the agora all the way down to the docks, I don't think anybody would have stopped him. But he didn't. And he made a stand, and I think it's what made him famous. World famous, renowned. He was prepared to take the hemlock, which is then in the next piece of writing. And that is something that we should learn from. You should, regardless of your age, stand up for justice. And to some extent, there's a real plausible argument or arguments as to why that should be. Definitely worth the read. Ta-ta for now.